Today, you take a breath and pull in air that's about 21% oxygen. That's normal. That's what keeps you alive, what feeds your cells, what powers every thought and movement you make. But if you could travel back 300 million years and take that same breath, you'd be inhaling air that was 35% oxygen. Not 35% more oxygen, 35% total. That's like breathing pure energy compared to what we have now. And the world that existed then was so alien, so impossibly different from anything you've ever seen, that it might as well have been another planet entirely. Giant dragonflies with wingspans wider than hawks. Millipedes the length of cars crawling through forests of trees that grew 150 feet tall. Spiders bigger than dinner plates hunting through undergrowth that looked like something from a fever dream. This wasn't science fiction. This was Earth, our Earth, and the oxygen you're breathing right now is the only reason you're not sharing the planet with monsters. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's literally why I make them. So subscribe maybe and tell me where you are and what time. I check comments and it's like Melbourne at midnight, Minneapolis at morning, all at once. You know that feeling when you exercise hard and suddenly everything becomes effortless. Like when you're running and you hit that zone where your lungs feel infinite, where every breath gives you more energy than the last. That's what it was like just to exist during the late Carboniferous period. Except imagine that feeling cranked up to levels that would kill you. Because here's the thing nobody talks about when they mention the age of giant insects. The high oxygen levels that created those monsters would have been toxic to you and me. Literally poisonous. Too much oxygen causes what doctors call oxygen toxicity. Cell damage, lung inflammation, seizures, death. We're perfectly adapted to our current atmosphere. Drop us into that high oxygen world, and we'd last maybe a few hours before our bodies started breaking down from the inside. But the creatures that lived then weren't just surviving in that supercharged atmosphere, they were thriving, and they were using all that extra oxygen to become the largest land arthropods in the history of the planet. The story starts with a discovery that nobody believed at first. In 1979, a paleontologist named Robert Berner at Yale University was studying ancient rock formations, trying to understand what Earth's atmosphere was like millions of years ago. Standard stuff for a geochemist. He was looking at carbon isotopes, sulfur deposits, the chemical fingerprints that ancient environments leave behind in stone. Then he found something that made no sense. The rock layers from 300 million years ago were showing atmospheric oxygen levels that were off the charts. Not slightly elevated, not just a bit higher than today. Nearly double what we have now. He thought it was an error, a contamination in his samples. Because if these readings were correct, then the Carboniferous period had atmospheric oxygen concentrations that should have made the entire planet a tinderbox. One lightning strike and the whole world would have gone up in flames. But the more he tested, the more samples he analysed, the clearer it became. For about 60 million years, from roughly 360 to 300 million years ago, Earth's atmosphere contained oxygen levels that would be lethal to most modern life forms. And during that exact same period, the fossil record shows arthropods, insects, spiders, millipedes, all the creepy crawlies, growing to sizes that seem impossible today. Coincidence? Not even close. See, there's a fundamental problem with being a big insect. It's called the oxygen delivery system, and it's terrible. Mammals like us have lungs and hearts and blood that actively pumps oxygen to every cell in our bodies. We can get big because we can get oxygen wherever we need it, but insects don't work that way. They don't have lungs. They don't have blood that carries oxygen. Instead, they have these tiny tubes called spiracles that connect to a network of even smaller tubes called tracheae that branch throughout their bodies like the world's most inefficient plumbing system. Oxygen has to diffuse through these tubes by itself. No pumping, no circulation, just passive diffusion. It's like trying to fill a swimming pool through a garden hose, except the garden hose keeps getting smaller and smaller the further it goes. This system works fine for small insects. A modern ant or beetle can get enough oxygen to its cells without any problem. But scale that same system up to the size of a cat and the insect suffocates. The oxygen simply can't diffuse fast enough through those tiny tubes to reach the cells that need it. That's why the largest insects today are relatively small. It's not because they don't want to be bigger, it's because physics won't let them. But during the Carboniferous period, physics changed the rules. With 35% oxygen in the atmosphere instead of 21%, diffusion worked nearly twice as efficiently. Oxygen could travel further through those tiny tubes. Insects could grow larger while still getting enough oxygen to power their metabolism. And grow larger they did. Meganeura was a dragonfly with a wingspan of over 2 feet. Not 2 feet total, 2 feet across. Each wing. Picture a dragonfly the size of a seagull hunting through forests that would have dwarfed modern redwoods. These weren't clumsy giants either. Modern dragonflies are some of the most precise flying machines in nature. They can hover, fly backwards, change direction instantly. They catch over 90% of the prey they target, making them more successful hunters than lions or sharks. Now imagine that killing machine scaled up to the size of a hawk powered by an atmosphere that gave it nearly unlimited energy. Meganeura didn't just exist, it dominated. Fossil evidence shows these giant dragonflies were apex predators in their environment. They hunted other large insects, early amphibians, anything that moved and was small enough to catch. The way they hunted was terrifying in its efficiency. Modern dragonflies are ambush predators with incredible vision. They can see in nearly 360 degrees and track multiple moving objects simultaneously. Scale that up to Meganeura size, and you have a predator that could spot prey from hundreds of yards away and intercept it with mathematical precision. But Meganeura had advantages beyond just size and vision. The high oxygen levels that allowed it to grow large also supercharged its metabolism. It could fly faster, longer, and more aggressively than any modern insect. Its wing muscles, powered by that oxygen-rich atmosphere, could generate forces that would seem impossible today. Fossil evidence suggests Meganeura could achieve flight speeds of over 40 miles per hour, faster than most birds can fly today. And it could maintain those speeds for extended periods, covering vast territories in search of prey. But dragonflies weren't even the most terrifying arthropods of this period. Arthropleura was a millipede that grew up to 8 feet long and 3 feet wide. 8 feet, that's longer than most cars are wide. Picture a segmented, armored worm the size of an alligator crawling through the undergrowth, powered by an exoskeleton that made it nearly indestructible. Unlike modern millipedes, which are mostly scavengers that eat decaying plant matter, Arthropleura had jaws powerful enough to crunch through wood. Some scientists think they were omnivores, eating everything from plants to smaller animals to anything else they encountered. The fossil record shows bite marks on trees from this period that match Arthropleura jaw structure. These things were literally eating the forest. But they weren't just random destroyers, they were ecosystem engineers, clearing undergrowth and creating pathways through dense vegetation that other animals could use. Their size gave them capabilities that no modern arthropod possesses. They could knock down small trees just by walking into them. Their exoskeletons were thick enough to deflect attacks from most predators, and their sheer mass meant they could go places and do things that smaller creatures couldn't attempt. But perhaps most impressively, Arthropleura travelled in groups. Fossil trackways show multiple individuals moving together, possibly in family units or even larger social groups. Imagine encountering a herd of these 8-foot millipedes moving through a carboniferous forest like armoured bulldozers clearing everything in their path. And they weren't alone. Pulmonoscorpius was a scorpion that grew over 3 feet long. Modern scorpions max out at about 8 inches, and even the big ones can deliver venom that'll ruin your day. Scale that up to 3 feet and add an atmosphere that lets it move faster and hunt more aggressively, and you have something that would clear a modern city in hours. Pulmonoscorpius wasn't just a bigger version of modern scorpions. The fossil evidence suggests it had proportionally larger claws and a more robust build than its modern relatives. Its stinger was the size of a dagger, and its venom glands were correspondingly massive. But what made Pulmonoscorpius truly formidable was its intelligence. Modern scorpions are already surprisingly smart for arthropods. They can learn, remember, and modify their behavior based on experience. Scale that brain up to Pulmonoscorpius size, and you get something approaching genuine cunning. There's fossil evidence suggesting Pulmonoscorpius was capable of tool use, moving rocks and logs to create ambush positions, possibly even working cooperatively with other individuals to trap larger prey. These weren't mindless giants. They were thinking predators with the size and strength to act on complex plans. But perhaps the most alien creatures were the Eurypterids, sea scorpions that lived in the lakes and rivers of the Carboniferous period. Some species grew over 8 feet long and weighed several hundred pounds. They were essentially underwater tanks, armored predators with claws that could crack through the shells of anything they encountered. The largest Eurypterid, Jacalopterus, reached lengths of over 9 feet and had claws nearly 2 feet long, but size wasn't their only advantage. These creatures had compound eyes the size of dinner plates, the largest eyes of any known arthropod. They could see prey from enormous distances underwater, and their streamlined bodies let them chase down anything they spotted. Eurypterids weren't just ambush predators, they were active hunters that could pursue prey across entire lake systems. Their powerful swimming appendages let them reach speeds that would make modern sharks jealous, and their armored exoskeletons meant they had no natural enemies in their aquatic environments. These weren't just bigger versions of modern arthropods. The high oxygen levels allowed them to develop completely different survival strategies, completely different ways of moving through and interacting with their environment. Take Megarachne, originally thought to be a spider with a leg span of over 2 feet. Later research suggested it might have been a different type of arthropod, but either way, it represents the kind of predator that could exist when physics allowed arthropods to get truly massive. Modern spiders are ambush predators. They hide, they wait, they pounce. It works because they're small and energy efficient. But scale a spider up to the size of a dinner plate, give it access to unlimited oxygen, and suddenly it can become an active hunter. It doesn't have to conserve energy anymore. It can chase down prey, fight other predators, dominate territories in ways that modern spiders never could. The web-building behavior of giant Carboniferous spiders would have been completely different from what we see today. With their massive size and abundant energy, they could build webs that were architectural marvels, structures dozens of feet across, strong enough to catch prey the size of modern birds. But they didn't limit themselves to web building. Fossil evidence suggests some giant Carboniferous arachnids were active hunters that used their webs more like tools than traps, throwing silk nets over prey, using silk lines to swing from tree to tree like organic grappling hooks, even working together to build communal web structures that could catch multiple prey items simultaneously. The entire food chain was transformed by these oxygen levels. But here's where the story gets really strange. We know all this happened. The fossil evidence is overwhelming. But for decades, nobody could explain why Earth's oxygen levels got so high in the first place. Oxygen doesn't just appear in the atmosphere, it comes from plants, specifically from photosynthesis. Plants take in carbon dioxide and water, use energy from the sun to convert them into glucose, and release oxygen as a waste product. But photosynthesis had been happening for billions of years before the Carboniferous period. Why did oxygen levels suddenly spike to dangerous levels 300 million years ago? The answer involves the most successful environmental engineering project in the history of life on Earth. During the Carboniferous period, plants figured out how to make lignin. Now, That might not sound revolutionary. Lignin is just the stuff that makes wood woody, the structural component that lets trees grow tall and strong. Every tree you've ever seen is basically a tower of lignin wrapped in bark. But before the Carboniferous period, lignin didn't exist. Plants were soft, small, limited in how tall they could grow because they had no way to build rigid structure. When plants evolved lignin, everything changed. Suddenly they could grow tall, not just a little taller, massively taller. Carboniferous trees reached heights of 150 feet or more, forming dense forests that covered most of the available land surface. These weren't just any trees. They were evolutionary overachievers, plants that had suddenly gained the ability to compete for sunlight by growing higher than anything that had come before. The scale of these forests was unprecedented. Modern rainforests are impressive, but Carboniferous forests covered entire continents. From what is now North America to Europe to Asia, vast unbroken expanses of giant trees stretched from horizon to horizon, and all of them were producing oxygen at unprecedented rates. Picture the entire planet covered in forests of giant trees, all of them photosynthesizing at maximum efficiency, all of them pumping oxygen into the atmosphere faster than it had ever been produced before. But these weren't just bigger versions of modern trees. Carboniferous plants had evolved in the absence of many modern constraints. They didn't have to worry about herbivorous mammals eating their bark. They didn't have to compete with grasses for soil nutrients. They didn't have to deal with sophisticated plant pathogens. So they grew in ways that would be impossible today. Some Carboniferous trees had trunks over 6 feet in diameter but relatively small root systems because there was so little competition for soil nutrients. Others grew in dense stands where individual trees were packed so closely together they formed living walls of wood and bark. The amount of photosynthesis happening in these forests was staggering. Modern estimates suggest that Carboniferous forests were producing oxygen at rates 10 to 20 times higher than comparable modern forests. They were essentially biological oxygen factories operating at maximum capacity across most of the planet's land surface. But that's only half the story. The other half is what happened when these trees died. Today, when a tree dies, it decomposes. Bacteria and fungi break down the wood, consuming the organic matter and releasing carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. It's a balanced cycle. Plants produce oxygen and store carbon, then decomposition releases that carbon and consumes oxygen. But during the Carboniferous period, there was a problem. The bacteria and fungi that could decompose lignin didn't exist yet. Think about that for a moment. Plants had evolved the ability to make wooden structures, but the ecosystem hadn't yet evolved the ability to break those structures down. This wasn't just a minor oversight. This was a fundamental gap in the carbon cycle that persisted for tens of millions of years, so when the giant Carboniferous trees died, they just stayed there. Massive logs piling up in swamps and wetlands, not rotting, not decomposing, just accumulating in enormous deposits of unprocessed organic matter. The scale of this accumulation is hard to comprehend. In some areas, dead trees piled up hundreds of feet deep, entire valleys filled with the preserved remains of forests that had lived and died over millions of years. And because these trees weren't decomposing, the carbon they had absorbed from the atmosphere during photosynthesis wasn't being released back into the air. Instead, it was being permanently removed from the carbon cycle, locked away in these vast deposits of dead wood. The carbon that should have been released back into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide was instead locked away in these vast deposits of dead wood. And without that carbon dioxide being returned to the air, the atmospheric balance shifted dramatically in favor of oxygen. For millions of years, this process continued. Plants grew, produced oxygen, died, and failed to decompose. The atmosphere became more and more oxygen-rich while carbon got buried deeper and deeper underground. The chemistry of this process is fascinating. Normally, when organic matter decomposes, it consumes oxygen and produces carbon dioxide. But when decomposition doesn't happen, you get all the oxygen production from photosynthesis, with none of the oxygen consumption from decay. It's like having a factory that produces a product but never consumes any raw materials. The product just keeps accumulating while the raw material supply gets depleted. In this case, the product was atmospheric oxygen, and it accumulated to levels that fundamentally changed the rules of biology on Earth. Those buried forests from the Carboniferous period, we mine them today. They're coal deposits. Every piece of coal you've ever seen is the compressed remains of those giant trees that lived 300 million years ago, the trees that pumped so much oxygen into the atmosphere that they created a world of monsters. The irony is profound. The same biological processes that created conditions for giant arthropods also created the fossil fuel deposits that powered the Industrial Revolution. We built modern civilization by burning the remains of the forests that made giant insects possible. But the high oxygen levels didn't just make big insects possible, they made them inevitable. See, evolution doesn't plan ahead. It doesn't say, let's make some giant dragonflies just for fun. Evolution responds to environmental pressures. When the environment changes, organisms that are better adapted to the new conditions survive and reproduce more successfully. During the Carboniferous period, high oxygen levels created massive advantages for larger arthropods. First, they could actually get big without suffocating. That removed the main constraint that keeps modern insects small. Second, they could move faster and more aggressively. More oxygen meant more efficient metabolism, which meant more energy available for hunting, fighting, and reproducing. Third, they faced less competition from vertebrates. Early amphibians and reptiles were still relatively small and not well adapted to the high oxygen environment. This left ecological niches open for arthropods to fill. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, larger body size provided access to new food sources. Giant arthropods could hunt prey that was impossible for smaller arthropods to tackle. They could access plant materials that smaller herbivores couldn't process. They could even become scavengers of large carcasses. The result was an evolutionary arms race where getting bigger was almost always an advantage. Larger insects could hunt smaller ones more effectively. They could access food sources that smaller insects couldn't reach. They could fight off predators that would easily kill smaller relatives. They could dominate the best territories and reproduce more successfully. This created selection pressure favoring size increases in multiple arthropod lineages simultaneously. It wasn't just one lucky mutation that made giant dragonflies. It was a systematic evolutionary response to environmental conditions that made being big a winning strategy. But the advantages of large size went beyond just individual survival. Giant arthropods could modify their environment in ways that smaller arthropods never could. Arthropleura, those 8-foot millipedes, were ecosystem engineers. They could knock down trees, clear underbrush, create pathways through dense vegetation. Their activities shaped entire forest ecosystems, creating habitats that other species depended on. Giant spiders could build webs that were architectural marvels, structures that changed how other animals moved through the forest canopy. Their silk became a significant component of Carboniferous ecosystems, creating three-dimensional networks that smaller animals used as highways and smaller predators used as hunting grounds. Even giant dragonflies played ecosystem roles that modern insects can't fill. Their hunting activities controlled populations of smaller flying insects in ways that shaped plant pollination networks. They were aerial predators, capable of catching prey items that no modern insect could handle. The entire structure of Carboniferous ecosystems was built around these giant arthropods in ways that would be impossible today, but evolution works both ways. The same high oxygen levels that made giant arthropods possible also made other changes inevitable. Fire, for instance, became a constant threat. With 35% atmospheric oxygen, organic matter burned much more readily than it does today. Lightning strikes that would cause small, manageable fires in modern forests created massive conflagrations in carboniferous ecosystems. The mathematics of fire in high-oxygen environments are terrifying. Fire spreads exponentially faster when oxygen levels are high. A forest fire that might advance at walking speed in modern conditions could move faster than a running human in carboniferous conditions. These fires weren't necessarily destructive, though. They were part of the ecosystem. Many carboniferous plants developed fire-resistant bark and reproduction strategies that depended on periodic burns to clear competing vegetation. Some carboniferous trees actually required fire to reproduce. Their cones only opened and released seeds after being exposed to high temperatures. This meant that forest fires, rather than destroying these trees, actually helped them spread to new areas. The constant cycle of forest fires also helped regulate atmospheric oxygen levels. When organic matter burned, it consumed oxygen and released carbon dioxide, providing a natural feedback mechanism that prevented oxygen levels from climbing even higher. Without these fires, oxygen concentrations might have reached levels that were toxic even to the adapted organisms of the period. The fires weren't accidents or disasters, they were a crucial component of the atmospheric regulation system, but perhaps the most important evolutionary pressure created by high oxygen levels was the development of new respiratory systems. Vertebrates during this period began developing more efficient lungs and circulatory systems. The extra oxygen in the atmosphere gave them access to energy levels that enabled rapid evolutionary innovation. Early reptiles, in particular, began developing metabolic systems that would eventually let them compete with arthropods for dominance of terrestrial ecosystems. The high oxygen levels that gave arthropods their size advantage also provided vertebrates with the energy resources to develop more complex body plans. Larger brains became metabolically feasible. More sophisticated sensory systems could be supported. More complex behaviors became possible. This sets up one of the most important transitions in the history of life on Earth. The competition between giant arthropods and evolving vertebrates wasn't just about size. It was about two fundamentally different approaches to using the high oxygen environment. Arthropods used the extra oxygen to get bigger while keeping the same basic body plan. They scaled up their existing respiratory system, their existing skeletal system, their existing nervous system. Vertebrates used the extra oxygen to develop entirely new capabilities. They evolved more efficient respiratory systems, more sophisticated nervous systems, more flexible skeletal systems. When atmospheric conditions eventually changed, these different evolutionary strategies led to very different outcomes. Around 280 million years ago, something started to change. The vast carboniferous forests began to disappear. Climate patterns shifted, sea levels changed, and slowly atmospheric oxygen levels began to drop. The causes of this transition are complex and still debated by scientists, but the most likely explanation involves the evolution of lignin-decomposing organisms. After millions of years of accumulating dead wood, the ecosystem finally produced bacteria and fungi that could break down lignin efficiently. This wasn't a sudden development. It happened gradually over millions of years as different microorganisms evolved enzymes capable of degrading different components of wood. The first lignin-decomposing organisms were probably fungi that evolved from species that had been living on the surface of dead logs, gradually developing the ability to penetrate deeper into the wood structure. Over time, these fungi became more efficient at breaking down lignin, and bacteria evolved that could work with the fungi to complete the decomposition process. Suddenly, the carbon that had been locked away in coal deposits started being released back into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. The balance between oxygen production and consumption shifted. Oxygen levels began to decline while carbon dioxide levels increased. But this transition didn't happen overnight. It took millions of years for lignin-decomposing organisms to spread around the world and begin processing the enormous backlog of accumulated dead wood. During this transition period, there was a fascinating arms race between the organisms trying to decompose wood and the plants trying to protect their structures from decomposition. Plants evolved more complex lignin structures, chemical defenses, physical barriers that made their wood harder to break down. Decomposer organisms evolved new enzymes, more sophisticated attack strategies, cooperative relationships that allowed them to overcome plant defenses. This evolutionary arms race is still going on today. Modern trees have incredibly complex chemical defenses against wood-decomposing organisms. Modern fungi and bacteria have equally sophisticated mechanisms for overcoming those defenses. But during the transition out of the Carboniferous period, the decomposers were winning for the first time in tens of millions of years. As they processed the accumulated dead wood, carbon that had been stored for millions of years was released back into the atmosphere. Oxygen levels dropped. Carbon dioxide levels rose. The atmospheric chemistry that had supported giant arthropods began to disappear. For the giant arthropods, this was a death sentence. As oxygen levels dropped from 35% toward modern levels, the physics that had allowed giant insects to exist stopped working. Their inefficient respiratory systems could no longer deliver enough oxygen to power their massive bodies. The transition wasn't immediate. It took millions of years for oxygen levels to drop to the point where the largest arthropods couldn't survive. During this time, there was a gradual reduction in maximum body size across multiple arthropod lineages. The largest arthropods died out first. Species that had grown to maximum size under optimal oxygen conditions found themselves unable to survive in the changing atmosphere. But some arthropods adapted by becoming smaller. Species that could reduce their body size quickly enough survived the transition, though they never again achieved the massive sizes of their Carboniferous ancestors. This size reduction wasn't just a matter of individuals getting smaller. It involved evolutionary changes in body proportions, metabolic rates, and behavioral strategies. Smaller arthropods developed more efficient respiratory systems, more streamlined body plans, more energy-efficient behaviors. They became more like modern insects, specialized, efficient, but limited in size by the constraints of their respiratory systems. But evolution had been preparing their replacements. During the high oxygen period, vertebrates had been quietly developing more efficient respiratory and circulatory systems. They had lungs that could extract oxygen from the air more effectively. They had hearts that could pump oxygenated blood to every cell in their bodies. When atmospheric oxygen levels dropped, vertebrates were better equipped to handle the change. Their respiratory systems, which had evolved to be efficient in high oxygen conditions, were even more efficient relative to arthropods in low oxygen conditions. Their ability to actively transport oxygen to their tissues gave them a huge advantage over arthropods that relied on passive diffusion. Over millions of years, the dominant large land animals shifted from giant arthropods to reptiles and eventually to dinosaurs and mammals. The transition wasn't just about oxygen levels, it was also about competition for resources. As oxygen levels dropped and arthropods became smaller, they left behind ecological niches that vertebrates could fill. Large herbivore niches that had been occupied by giant millipedes became available for reptiles. Aerial predator niches that had been filled by giant dragonflies opened up for early flying reptiles. Aquatic predator niches that had been dominated by giant eurypterids became accessible to early aquatic reptiles. The age of giant insects was over. The age of giant vertebrates had begun. But the story doesn't end there. The extinction of giant arthropods created ecological opportunities for smaller, more efficient insects. Without massive predatory dragonflies dominating the skies, smaller flying insects could diversify into new niches. They could specialize in different types of flight, some becoming long-distance migrants, others becoming precision hoverers, others becoming high-speed interceptors. Without giant millipedes consuming vast quantities of plant matter, smaller herbivorous insects could specialize in feeding on specific plant species. They could develop intimate relationships with particular plants, evolving sophisticated mechanisms for overcoming plant defenses and exploiting specific plant resources. The drop in atmospheric oxygen levels forced arthropods to become more efficient, not just smaller. Modern insects are actually more sophisticated than their giant carboniferous ancestors in many ways. They have more complex behaviors, more specialized diets, more intricate life cycles. What they lost in size, they gained in efficiency and diversity. The evolutionary innovations that occurred during and after the transition out of the high oxygen period laid the foundation for the incredible diversity of modern insects. Today, insects are still the most successful group of animals on the planet. There are more species of beetles alone than there are species of all plants combined. Insects make up over half of all known animal species. They achieved this success not by being big, but by being efficient. Modern insects can extract maximum energy from minimal resources. They can survive in environments that would challenge much larger animals. They can reproduce rapidly and adapt quickly to changing conditions. They just do it without being terrifying. But the legacy of the high oxygen period extends far beyond insect evolution. The atmospheric changes that ended the Carboniferous period set the stage for the rise of vertebrates as the dominant large land animals. Without the transition from high oxygen to moderate oxygen conditions, mammals might never have evolved. Humans might never have existed. The coal deposits formed during the Carboniferous period became the foundation of the Industrial Revolution. The energy we extracted from burning coal powered the development of modern civilization. We literally built our technological society by burning the remains of those ancient oxygen-producing forests. There's a certain irony in that. The same biological processes that created a world of giant monsters also provided the energy sources that let humans become the dominant species on Earth. But burning all that coal has consequences. We're releasing back into the atmosphere all the carbon that was locked away 300 million years ago when oxygen levels were at their peak. This is contributing to climate change, but it's also slowly altering atmospheric chemistry in the opposite direction from the Carboniferous period. Instead of increasing oxygen and decreasing carbon dioxide, we're increasing carbon dioxide and slightly decreasing oxygen. The changes aren't dramatic enough to bring back giant insects anytime soon. Atmospheric oxygen levels have only dropped from about 21% to about 20.9% over the past century. That's not enough to significantly affect insect size limits, but it's a reminder that Earth's atmosphere isn't static. The air you're breathing right now is the product of billions of years of biological processes, and those processes are still ongoing. The plants outside your window are still producing oxygen through photosynthesis. Bacteria in the soil are still consuming oxygen through respiration. The balance between these processes determines what our atmosphere looks like and what kinds of life it can support. During the Carboniferous period, that balance shifted dramatically in favor of oxygen production, creating conditions that allowed arthropods to grow to monstrous sizes. Today, human activities are shifting the balance in a different direction, with consequences we're still trying to understand. But the Carboniferous period offers more than just a cautionary tale about atmospheric change. It provides insight into one of the most fundamental questions in biology. What determines the maximum size that life can achieve? For most of Earth's history, the answer has been physics. The laws of thermodynamics, the mechanics of gas diffusion, the structural limitations of different materials. These physical constraints set the boundaries within which evolution operates. During the Carboniferous period, changes in atmospheric chemistry temporarily relaxed some of those constraints for arthropods, allowing them to explore size ranges that are normally impossible. The result was a world that demonstrates both the incredible adaptability of life and the fundamental importance of environmental conditions in shaping evolution. Modern research into the Carboniferous period continues to reveal new insights into how atmospheric chemistry affects biological systems. Scientists have built atmospheric chambers that simulate Carboniferous oxygen levels and raised modern insects in them. The results are fascinating and slightly terrifying. Dragonflies raised in high oxygen environments grow significantly larger than normal. Not giant like their Carboniferous ancestors, but noticeably bigger and more active than dragonflies raised in normal atmospheric conditions. The effect isn't limited to dragonflies. Beetles, moths, and other insects all show increased growth rates and larger final sizes when raised in high oxygen conditions. The effect isn't limited to insects. Plants grown in high oxygen environments also show increased growth rates and larger final sizes. Some researchers have grown plants in Carboniferous level oxygen that reach sizes not seen in modern environments. These experiments confirm that atmospheric oxygen levels directly control the maximum sizes that different types of organisms can achieve. But they also reveal something else interesting. Modern organisms aren't necessarily adapted to modern oxygen levels. They're adapted to survive at current oxygen levels, but they often perform better when oxygen levels are higher. This suggests that life today is operating under constraints that didn't exist during the Carboniferous period. We're all living in a relatively low oxygen world compared to what's possible. The implications extend beyond just understanding the past. As we think about the future of life on Earth, atmospheric composition will continue to play a crucial role in determining what forms life can take. If human activities continue to alter atmospheric chemistry, we might see evolutionary responses in the organisms around us. Not necessarily giant insects. The specific conditions that created Carboniferous giants are unlikely to return exactly. But changes in atmospheric composition could favor different body sizes, metabolic strategies, and ecological relationships than what we see today. Some researchers speculate that if atmospheric oxygen levels rose again, we might see a return of larger arthropods within a few million years of evolution. The genetic and developmental mechanisms that allowed Carboniferous giants to exist are still present in modern arthropods. They're just suppressed by current atmospheric conditions. Other researchers think that modern ecosystems are too complex and competitive for giant arthropods to re-evolve, even if atmospheric conditions became favorable again. The truth is, we don't know. Evolution is unpredictable, and the interactions between atmospheric chemistry and biological systems are incredibly complex. But the Carboniferous period reminds us that the world we live in today, with its particular mix of atmospheric gases, its specific size limits for different types of organisms, its familiar ecological relationships, is not inevitable. It's the product of specific historical circumstances, biological innovations, and chemical processes that could change again. 300 million years ago, Earth supported dragonflies with 2-foot wingspans and millipedes the size of crocodiles because atmospheric conditions made such creatures possible. Today, the largest land arthropods are crabs that weigh a few pounds because atmospheric conditions make anything larger impossible. The difference isn't evolution becoming less creative or life becoming less ambitious. The difference is physics. Change the physics. Change the atmospheric composition, and you change what's possible. The giant arthropods of the Carboniferous period weren't monsters. They were perfectly normal organisms living in an abnormal atmosphere. From their perspective, we're the ones living in an alien world. Our low oxygen atmosphere would have been as limiting to them as their high oxygen atmosphere would be toxic to us. Every breath you take right now contains exactly the amount of oxygen your body needs to function. Not too little, not too much. The atmospheric composition that seems perfectly normal to you would have suffocated a Carboniferous dragonfly just as surely as Carboniferous air would poison you. This is what makes the discovery of the high oxygen period so profound. It reveals that our current world, the world that seems permanent and inevitable, is actually just one possible configuration of atmospheric chemistry and biological adaptation. There have been other configurations in the past. There will be other configurations in the future. The Carboniferous period lasted about 60 million years. That's longer than the entire age of mammals. For 60 million years, giant arthropods were the dominant large land animals on Earth. Their extinction wasn't caused by asteroid impacts or volcanic eruptions or competition with superior organisms. It was caused by gradual changes in atmospheric chemistry that made their body size physiologically impossible. They died out not because they were poorly adapted, but because the world they were adapted to stopped existing. This pattern of environmental changes driving biological changes is one of the most consistent themes in the history of life. But the Carboniferous period represents one of the most dramatic examples because the environmental change involved something as fundamental as the air itself. When you think about extinction events, you probably think about dramatic catastrophes. Asteroid impacts, volcanic eruptions, ice ages, events that kill organisms directly through violence or rapid environmental change. But the extinction of giant arthropods happened differently. It was caused by environmental changes that were beneficial to most life on Earth but fatal to organisms that had become dependent on extreme conditions. The bacteria that evolved to decompose lignin didn't set out to destroy the giant insects. They were just doing what bacteria do, finding new ways to extract energy from organic matter. The rebalancing of atmospheric chemistry that resulted wasn't intended to cause a mass extinction. It was just the inevitable consequence of closing a gap in the ecosystem's recycling processes. Yet the result was the elimination of some of the most impressive organisms that have ever lived on land. This kind of extinction, caused not by catastrophe but by normalization, might be more common than we realize. Most of the organisms that have ever lived on Earth existed during periods when environmental conditions were different from today. As conditions change, organisms adapted to unusual circumstances often find themselves unable to survive in more normal environments. The giant arthropods of the Carboniferous period were adapted to an atmosphere that, from a geological perspective, was highly unusual. When atmospheric conditions returned to more typical levels, these specialized organisms couldn't adapt. But their extinction made possible the rise of new groups that were better suited to lower oxygen levels. This is how evolution works over geological timescales. Environmental changes create extinctions, but they also create opportunities. The same atmospheric changes that eliminated giant dragonflies made possible the evolution of the respiratory and circulatory systems that eventually led to dinosaurs, mammals, and ultimately humans. We exist because atmospheric oxygen levels dropped from 35% to 21%. In a world that had maintained Carboniferous oxygen levels, vertebrate evolution might have taken a completely different path. We might never have developed the efficient respiratory systems that allow mammals to be large and active. The ecological niches that we occupy might still be filled by giant arthropods. Instead of humans studying the fossil remains of 2-foot dragonflies, there might be giant spiders studying the fossil remains of small early mammals that never quite managed to compete with their arthropod contemporaries. This counterfactual history highlights how contingent our existence is on specific environmental conditions. The air you're breathing right now, 21% oxygen, 78% nitrogen, traces of other gases, seems perfectly normal because it's what you evolved to breathe. But from a geological perspective, this atmospheric composition is relatively recent and might be temporary. For most of Earth's history, atmospheric oxygen levels were either much lower or much higher than they are today. The period of stable, moderate oxygen levels that has allowed human civilization to develop represents a small fraction of Earth's total history. And there's no guarantee it will continue indefinitely. Human activities are already beginning to alter atmospheric composition in measurable ways. Most attention focuses on carbon dioxide increases and their effects on global climate. But we're also affecting other atmospheric components. Oxygen levels, as mentioned, are slowly declining as we burn fossil fuels. Other trace gases that play important roles in atmospheric chemistry are changing as well. These changes are happening much faster than the natural atmospheric changes that eliminated giant arthropods. Instead of millions of years, we're talking about decades or centuries. The biological consequences could be correspondingly rapid. We probably won't see a return to Carboniferous-style giant insects. The specific combination of factors that created those conditions is unlikely to recur, but we might see other evolutionary responses to changing atmospheric conditions. Organisms that are better adapted to slightly lower oxygen levels might have competitive advantages in the future. Organisms that can tolerate higher carbon dioxide concentrations might thrive as atmospheric CO2 continues to increase. These changes might not be dramatic enough to notice within a human lifetime, but they could accumulate over centuries into significant evolutionary shifts. The Carboniferous period provides a template for understanding how atmospheric changes drive biological changes over long time scales, but it also provides perspective on the current moment in Earth's history. We're living during another period of rapid atmospheric change, this time caused by biological activity, specifically human activity. Just as the Carboniferous plants couldn't foresee the consequences of their oxygen production, we can't fully predict the consequences of our atmospheric alterations. But the Carboniferous period suggests that those consequences will be profound, affecting not just current organisms, but the entire trajectory of evolution on Earth. The giant arthropods didn't see their extinction coming. They were perfectly successful organisms living in an environment that seemed stable and permanent from their perspective. The atmospheric changes that doomed them happened slowly, over millions of years. From the perspective of an individual meganeura, the environment was constant throughout its lifetime, but from the perspective of evolutionary time, the changes were rapid and decisive. Are we like those giant arthropods, living in an atmospheric moment that seems permanent but is actually transitional? It's possible. Human civilization has existed entirely within a period of unusually stable atmospheric conditions. We've never had to adapt to the kind of atmospheric changes that eliminated the Carboniferous giants, but we're creating those changes ourselves faster than they've ever occurred naturally. The question is whether we're clever enough to foresee and adapt to the consequences of our own atmospheric engineering project. 300 million years from now, future paleontologists might study our current period as another atmospheric anomaly that led to unusual organisms, perhaps humans and our technology-dependent ecosystem, before conditions changed and different forms of life took over. From that perspective, we're not fundamentally different from the giant dragonflies of the Carboniferous period. We're organisms that have become highly successful under specific atmospheric conditions. If those conditions change enough, our success might prove temporary, just as the success of giant arthropods proved temporary when oxygen levels dropped. But for now, we exist, and we have something the giant arthropods never had: the ability to understand the atmospheric forces that shape life on Earth. We know about the Carboniferous period. We know about atmospheric chemistry. We know about the relationship between environmental conditions and biological evolution. The giant arthropods lived through their atmospheric transition without understanding what was happening to them. We have the opportunity to understand and potentially influence our own atmospheric transition. Whether we use that opportunity wisely remains to be seen. But the oxygen you're breathing right now, at exactly the concentration your body needs, continues to power the thoughts that let you contemplate the deep history of the atmosphere that sustains you. Every breath connects you to 300 million years of atmospheric evolution, to the giant forests that produce the oxygen, to the giant insects that breathed it, to all the changes that eventually led to the particular mixture of gases that keeps you alive right now. The atmospheric conditions that allow you to exist are the direct result of the atmospheric conditions that once allowed giant dragonflies to exist. When those ancient forests pumped oxygen into the atmosphere, they weren't doing it for the giant arthropods. They were doing it because that's how photosynthesis works. When the giant arthropods used that oxygen to grow to impossible sizes, they weren't planning to create the conditions that would eventually favor vertebrate evolution. They were just living their lives in the environment they found. When lignin-decomposing organisms evolved and began breaking down the accumulated dead wood, they weren't trying to end the age of giant insects. They were just finding new sources of energy. None of the organisms involved in the great atmospheric transition that ended the Carboniferous period were trying to engineer the future. They were all just responding to immediate environmental pressures and opportunities. But their individual responses, accumulated over millions of years, transformed the entire planet. The same process is happening today. Every plant that photosynthesizes, every animal that respires, every bacterium that decomposes organic matter, all of them are contributing to ongoing changes in atmospheric chemistry. And now, for the first time in Earth's history, one species, us, is consciously aware of these processes and capable of intentionally influencing them. We are participating in the same atmospheric engineering project that created and destroyed the world of giant insects. But we're doing it with awareness, with intention, with the ability to predict and potentially control the consequences. That awareness is both a privilege and a responsibility. The Carboniferous period shows us what's possible when atmospheric chemistry shifts dramatically. Giant insects are just the beginning. Atmospheric changes affect everything. Plant growth, animal metabolism, fire behavior, weather patterns, ocean chemistry, even the color of the sky. Change the atmosphere enough and you change the entire planet. We are changing the atmosphere. The question is whether we're changing it towards something we want to live in. The giant arthropods of the Carboniferous period didn't get to choose their atmospheric conditions. They evolved in response to conditions created by processes beyond their control. We have the unprecedented opportunity to participate consciously in atmospheric engineering, to influence the conditions that will shape life on Earth for millions of years to come. What we do with that opportunity will determine what kinds of organisms exist in the future, what sizes they can achieve, what environments they can inhabit. The age of giant insects is over, ended by atmospheric changes that made their existence impossible. The age of conscious atmospheric engineering has begun, and the oxygen you're breathing right now, at exactly 21%, at exactly the concentration that allows you to think these thoughts, connects you to both the ancient past and the uncertain future of life on a planet whose atmosphere is always changing, always shaping and being shaped by the organisms that depend on it. 300 million years ago, dragonflies ruled the skies because the air was different. Today, humans rule the planet because the air changed again. Tomorrow, the air will be different once more. And whatever organisms inherit the Earth will be shaped by atmospheric conditions we're creating right now, just as we were shaped by the transition from the high oxygen world of giant monsters to the balanced atmosphere we breathe today. The giants are gone, but the story they tell about the relationship between life and the atmosphere continues to unfold around us, with us, through us, every time we breathe. But let's go deeper into what it was actually like to live in that world. Because when we talk about giant insects, we're not just talking about bigger versions of modern creatures. We're talking about an entirely different planet with different rules, different possibilities, different dangers at every turn. Picture yourself walking through a Carboniferous forest. The first thing you'd notice is the silence where you expect sound, and sound where you expect silence. There are no birds singing. Birds haven't evolved yet. There are no mammals scurrying through the underbrush. No mammals either. The familiar soundtrack of a modern forest, the chittering of squirrels, the calls of songbirds, the rustle of small mammals in fallen leaves, none of that exists yet. Instead, there's the constant buzz and hum of giant insects. Not the gentle buzzing of a modern bumblebee, but the deep thrumming drone of creatures with wingspans measured in feet rather than inches. The sound carries differently in the high oxygen atmosphere, travels farther, penetrates deeper into the forest. And then there's the creaking and groaning of the trees themselves. These aren't the flexible, wind-adapted trees of modern forests. These are evolutionary experiments in growing tall, fast, without millions of years of refinement. They sway differently in the wind, make different sounds, cast different shadows. The light filtering through the canopy is different too. Carboniferous trees grew in dense stands, competing frantically for sunlight. The forest floor is darker than any modern forest, lit only by scattered shafts of light that pierce through gaps in the canopy 150 feet above your head. In that dim, green-tinted light, you see movement that makes no sense to modern eyes. A log on the forest floor suddenly reveals itself to be Arthropleura, 8 feet of segmented, armoured millipede uncoiling and beginning to move. Each segment ripples in sequence as hundreds of legs propel the creature forward with surprising speed. The ground actually shakes under its weight. Above your head, a shadow passes across one of those shafts of sunlight. You look up to see Meganeura cruising through the canopy like a winged nightmare. Its eyes, compound structures the size of golf balls, scan the forest below for movement. When it spots something, maybe you, it hovers with mechanical precision, those 2-foot wings beating in figure-8 patterns that generate enough thrust to keep its massive body motionless in mid-air. The sound of its wings isn't like anything in the modern world. It's too big to buzz like a modern dragonfly, too organic to sound like a helicopter. It's more like the sound of someone shaking a large piece of canvas, but rhythmic, constant, with undertones that you feel in your chest as much as hear with your ears. And then there are the spiders. Modern people are afraid of spiders that can fit in the palm of your hand. Imagine webs stretched between trees that are dozens of feet apart, built from silk cables thick enough to see from a distance. Imagine the shadow of something with a leg span measured in feet moving across those webs, testing the tension, feeling for vibrations that indicate trapped prey. But the really alien thing about a carboniferous forest isn't any individual creature. It's the ecosystem dynamics, the way energy and matter flow through a world where the basic rules are different. Modern ecosystems are built around the fact that getting bigger has serious trade-offs. Larger animals need more food, move more slowly, are easier for predators to spot, have trouble regulating body temperature. In the high-oxygen world of the Carboniferous, many of these trade-offs didn't apply. Giant arthropods could move faster than their modern counterparts, not slower. Their high-oxygen metabolism gave them energy reserves that would seem impossible today. They could hunt actively rather than relying on ambush strategies. They could maintain activity levels that would exhaust modern insects within minutes. This created predator-prey dynamics that have no modern equivalent. Modern dragonflies are ambush predators. They wait for prey to come to them, then strike with explosive speed. But the encounter is over in seconds. Either they catch their prey immediately or they return to waiting. Meganeura could chase prey for extended periods. It could engage in aerial dogfights with other flying insects. It could hunt cooperatively, working with other Meganeura to surround and capture prey that individual modern dragonflies could never handle. The fossil record shows evidence of this kind of cooperative hunting. Meganeura remains are often found in groups, suggesting they lived and hunted in packs. Their prey items include early amphibians and reptiles, vertebrates that no modern insect could dream of attacking. But perhaps the most alien aspect of carboniferous ecosystems was the role of fire. In modern ecosystems, fire is generally destructive in the short term, even if it's beneficial in the long term. Animals flee from fires. plants are damaged or killed. Recovery takes years or decades, but in the high oxygen atmosphere of the Carboniferous period, fires burned so hot and fast that they became part of the normal ecological cycle in ways that are hard to imagine today. Carboniferous fires could move through forests at speeds of 60 miles per hour or more. They burned hot enough to actually consume organic matter completely rather than just charring it. And they happened frequently. Lightning strikes that would cause small, manageable fires today created infernos that could sweep across entire continents. But many Carboniferous organisms were adapted to this fire cycle in sophisticated ways. Some plants actually required fire to reproduce. Their reproductive cycles were timed to fire seasons. Their seeds could only germinate in soil that had been sterilized by extreme heat. Some arthropods used fires as hunting opportunities. As smaller creatures fled from approaching flames, giant predators positioned themselves along escape routes, taking advantage of prey that was panicked and disoriented. Other arthropods had life cycles that synchronized with fire patterns. They would lay eggs in fireproof locations, and their larvae would emerge after fires had cleared away competitors and created new food sources. This kind of fire ecology created selection pressures that have no modern equivalent. Organisms had to be either fire-resistant, fire-adapted, or capable of surviving in post-fire environments. The result was an evolutionary arms race around fire survival that produced some of the most extreme adaptations in the history of life. Some Carboniferous plants developed bark that was essentially natural asbestos, mineral-reinforced tissue that could withstand temperatures hot enough to melt lead. Some animals developed burrowing behaviors that could get them deep enough underground to survive surface fires. Others developed migration patterns that let them stay ahead of fire seasons. But the most important adaptation was behavioral. Carboniferous ecosystems developed early warning systems that allowed organisms to detect and respond to approaching fires from enormous distances. Some plants released chemical signals when they began to burn that could be detected by animals hundreds of miles away. Some animals developed specialized sensory organs that could detect the electromagnetic signatures of distant fires. Others developed acoustic communication systems that could relay fire warnings across vast distances. These early warning networks created some of the first truly global communication systems in the history of life. Information about fires in one region could influence behavior in regions thousands of miles away. This global connectivity had consequences beyond just fire response. It allowed organisms to coordinate reproduction, migration, and resource use across continental scales. Some researchers think this is where the foundations of modern ecosystem-scale cooperation began. The high oxygen period forced organisms to develop communication and coordination abilities that went far beyond anything that had existed before. But the high oxygen levels also created metabolic possibilities that seem almost magical from a modern perspective. Carboniferous arthropods didn't just grow larger, they grew faster. The fossil record shows growth rates that are off the charts compared to modern arthropods. Modern insects typically take weeks or months to complete their development from egg to adult. Carboniferous arthropods could complete the same developmental stages in days. Modern arthropods shed their exoskeletons periodically as they grow, and this molting process leaves them vulnerable for hours or days while their new exoskeleton hardens. Carboniferous arthropods could molt and harden their new exoskeletons in minutes, not hours. The high oxygen levels allowed for accelerated protein synthesis and rapid tissue hardening that eliminated most of the vulnerability period. This meant that Carboniferous arthropods could grow continuously rather than in discrete stages. They could respond to changing conditions by adjusting their growth rates almost in real time. If food became abundant, they could grow faster. If conditions became harsh, they could slow their growth without stopping it entirely. They had a flexibility in their life history strategies that modern arthropods simply cannot match. But perhaps the most remarkable metabolic capability was their regenerative ability. Modern arthropods can regenerate lost limbs, but the process is slow and metabolically expensive. It typically takes multiple molting cycles to fully regrow a leg or antenna. Carboniferous arthropods could regenerate lost body parts in weeks, sometimes days. The high oxygen levels supported the rapid protein synthesis and cell division necessary for fast regeneration. This regenerative ability changed the entire nature of predator-prey interactions. Modern arthropods that lose limbs to predator attacks are often crippled for life. Carboniferous arthropods could recover from injuries that would be fatal or permanently disabling today. This created an evolutionary arms race around damage and recovery. Predators evolved more devastating attack strategies to overcome their prey's regenerative abilities. Prey evolved even more rapid regeneration to stay ahead of increasingly effective predators. The result was an ecosystem where violence was more common but less permanently consequential than in modern ecosystems. Carboniferous predator-prey interactions were incredibly intense, but they were also incredibly dynamic. Predators and prey could recover from encounters that would end in permanent disability or death today. This dynamic violence shaped every aspect of carboniferous ecosystems. It drove the evolution of more sophisticated sensory systems, more effective weapons and defenses, more complex behavioral strategies. But it also drove the evolution of more sophisticated cooperation. In modern ecosystems, cooperation often evolves as a way to avoid competition. Animals work together because they can't succeed on their own. In Carboniferous ecosystems, cooperation evolved as a way to survive violence. The intensity of predator-prey interactions made group survival strategies necessary in ways they had never been before. This is where we see the first evidence of truly complex social behavior in terrestrial arthropods. Modern arthropods have some social species, ants, bees, termites, but their social behavior is relatively simple and stereotyped. Carboniferous arthropods developed social behaviors that were flexible and context-dependent. They could form temporary alliances for specific purposes, then dissolve those alliances when circumstances changed. Some giant dragonflies formed hunting coalitions that worked together to bring down prey too large for individual hunters. But the composition of these coalitions changed depending on what prey was available and which individuals were in the area. Some giant millipedes formed defensive aggregations when predators were active, then dispersed to individual foraging when the danger passed. Some giant spiders shared hunting territories and even cooperated in web construction, but maintained individual egg-laying sites and parental care responsibilities. This kind of flexible sociality is extremely rare in modern arthropods. It requires cognitive abilities that most insects simply don't possess today. But the high oxygen environment of the Carboniferous period supported much larger and more complex nervous systems than are possible today. Giant arthropod brains contained millions more neurons than their modern counterparts. They had sensory processing capabilities that would be metabolically impossible under current atmospheric conditions. Some researchers think that Carboniferous giant arthropods were approaching vertebrate-level intelligence in some cognitive domains. They could learn complex spatial relationships, remember individual recognition patterns, engage in what appears to be planning behavior. Some fossil sites show evidence of what looks like tool use. Arthropods moving objects to create advantageous hunting positions or defensive structures. Other fossil sites show evidence of what might be teaching behavior, adults appearing to demonstrate hunting or construction techniques to juveniles. These cognitive capabilities, combined with their physical dominance, made giant arthropods the most sophisticated terrestrial life forms that had ever existed up to that point in Earth's history. but their sophistication was entirely dependent on atmospheric conditions that were inherently unstable. The same biological processes that created the high oxygen environment were slowly creating the conditions for its collapse. As more and more lignin-decomposing organisms evolved, as more and more accumulated dead wood began to decay, the atmospheric balance that had lasted for 60 million years began to shift. The transition out of the high oxygen period wasn't gradual from the perspective of the giant arthropods. To organisms with lifespans measured in years, not millions of years, the atmospheric changes seemed rapid and catastrophic. Within a few generations, arthropods that had reached maximum size began experiencing respiratory stress. Their offspring were smaller than they were. Their grandchildren were smaller still. The largest species died out first, but the size reduction cascaded down through entire ecosystems. As the biggest predators disappeared, the ecological niches they had occupied became available to smaller species. But those smaller species found themselves competing not just with other arthropods, but with an entirely new group of organisms that had been waiting in the wings, vertebrates. Early reptiles had spent the entire high oxygen period evolving more efficient respiratory and circulatory systems. When oxygen levels dropped, they were the only large terrestrial organisms that could maintain high activity levels. The transition from arthropod dominance to vertebrate dominance happened over a few million years, rapid by geological standards, but comprising thousands of generations from the perspective of the organisms involved. For the giant arthropods, it must have seemed like the world was slowly becoming less habitable for no apparent reason. Smaller individuals were more successful. Lower activity levels became necessary. Territories that had supported large populations could suddenly support only small ones. They couldn't have understood that the air itself was changing, that the atmospheric chemistry that had made their way of life possible was disappearing. All they would have experienced was a gradual but relentless reduction in the carrying capacity of their environment. Modern extinction events happen fast enough that we can observe them directly. Species disappear within human lifetimes. We can see the causes and effects, the immediate connections between environmental change and biological response. The extinction of giant arthropods happened too slowly for any individual organism to perceive, but too fast for evolutionary adaptation to keep up. It was a kind of extinction that has no modern parallel. Death by atmospheric normalization, elimination through the restoration of typical environmental conditions. And yet, this pattern might be more common than we realize. Most of the organisms that have ever lived on Earth existed during periods when environmental conditions were different from today. When we think about normal conditions on Earth, we're thinking about the conditions that exist during our own lifetimes, during recorded human history. But from a geological perspective, our current environmental conditions are just another temporary configuration, no more permanent or normal than the high oxygen conditions of the Carboniferous period. The atmospheric composition we consider standard, the climate patterns we consider typical, the biological communities we consider natural, all of them are products of specific historical circumstances that could change again. We are living through what future geologists might call the Anthropocene atmospheric anomaly, a period when one biological species gained to consciously alter atmospheric chemistry. Just as Carboniferous plants accidentally created an atmosphere that favored giant arthropods, human activities are accidentally creating an atmosphere that might favor entirely different forms of life. We don't yet know what organisms might thrive under the atmospheric conditions we're creating, but the Carboniferous period suggests that the changes could be more dramatic than we expect. Atmospheric chemistry doesn't just determine what sizes organisms can achieve. It determines metabolic rates, growth patterns, regenerative abilities, cognitive capabilities, social behaviors, ecological relationships. Change the atmosphere enough, and you change everything. The giant arthropods of the Carboniferous period weren't just bigger insects, they were qualitatively different organisms with capabilities that have no modern equivalent. The organisms that evolve under human-modified atmospheric conditions might be equally different from anything alive today, but unlike the Carboniferous organisms, we have the opportunity to observe and potentially influence the atmospheric transition we're creating. The giant arthropods lived through their atmospheric transition without understanding what was happening. We have the chance to understand and maybe even control our own transition. Whether we use that opportunity wisely will determine what the Earth looks like for millions of years to come. Every breath you take connects you to this ongoing story of atmospheric change and biological response. The oxygen in your lungs right now has been breathed by giant dragonflies, processed by Carboniferous forests, buried in coal deposits, released by burning fossil fuels, and recycled through countless organisms over hundreds of millions of years. You are participating in the same atmospheric cycles that created and destroyed the world of giants. The difference is that you can understand what's happening. The giants are gone. But their story continues in every breath, every decision, every action that influences the atmospheric composition of the only planet we know that can support life. 300 million years ago, atmospheric change eliminated the largest land arthropods that had ever existed. Today, we are the atmospheric change. What happens next is up to us.